The moment Grogu entered Luke Skywalker's care, the narrative positioned him within a long arc that aligned with the structural logic of Star Wars storytelling rather than short-term spectacle. The franchise established a clear precedent in which characters with strong Force potential required dedicated instruction to navigate the psychological and practical demands of that connection. Grogu's departure reversed that established logic by placing him back into an environment that offered protection but not development. The shift diluted a storyline built on discipline, recovery, and the rediscovery of Jedi philosophy, replacing it with episodic mobility rather than long-term growth driven by coherent training dynamics. The foundational purpose of Luke's new temple was to illustrate how the post-war galaxy rebuilt intellectual and spiritual frameworks lost during the fall of the Jedi. Grogu's presence at the temple was not merely a symbolic gesture, it represented the opportunity to examine instruction from a perspective shaped by the failures of the previous generation. Luke was positioned to confront historical errors by guiding a student whose trauma preceded his formal training. Removing Grogu detached the most thematically appropriate subject from the environment, best suited to explore the process of reconstruction. Without Grogu, the temple narrative lacked the emotional and pedagogical anchor that justified its existence. Grogu's abilities required structured refinement rather than intermittent activation. His earliest displays of power revealed instability, exhaustion, and difficulty managing emotion-driven responses. These traits indicated the need for a systematic approach to discipline, one rooted in consistent guidance. Under Luke, Grogu had access to an instructor with first-hand knowledge of the consequences of inadequate training. Luke offered a combination of experience and restraint that aligned with Grogu's vulnerabilities. Returning Grogu to Din placed him in a setting where his abilities functioned as spontaneous tools rather than components of a framework grounded in intentional cultivation of skill and self-regulation. The relationship between Luke and Grogu also served Luke's long-term arc by grounding his early years as a teacher in a student who challenged his assumptions without threatening his authority. Grogu's presence allowed Luke to refine the principles he learned from Yoda and Obi-Wan while adapting them to a new era. The dynamic mirrored the nature of mentorship as a reciprocal process. Luke had something to teach, but he also had something to evaluate, particularly the balance between detachment and compassion. Removing Grogu prematurely disrupted an arc built to examine how Luke attempted to modernize Jedi tradition. The separation halted the examination before it could achieve meaningful narrative depth. Grogu's internal conflict between Mandalorian identity and Jedi heritage required careful exploration within a stable environment. Remaining with Luke placed him in a setting suited to unpacking memory fragmentation, past trauma, and inherited cultural expectations. The temple offered the resources, structure, and calm required for introspective progress. Din's lifestyle, shaped by constant travel, conflict, and contingency, lacked the stability to guide Grogu through identity formation. Returning to Din shifted Grogu's arc from deliberate growth to situational adaptation, diminishing narrative opportunities that had been set up as long-form developments. Luke's methodology, shaped by the failures of the prequel era, was constructed to offer Grogu a measured reintroduction to the Force that avoided indoctrination or coercion. Grogu's training was built around principle rather than urgency, reflection rather than combat. This approach aligned with the thematic direction of a post-Empire galaxy striving for renewed philosophical coherence. Removing Grogu undermined that thematic momentum by reorienting the character back toward reactive survival patterns rather than structured evolution driven by the rebuilding of Jedi ideology. Grogu's time at the temple also carried implications for broader galactic history. His presence could have provided insight into the early development of Luke's order, clarifying how Luke approached curriculum design, ethical training, and assessments of risk. These elements would have offered narrative continuity, bridging the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy. The decision to have Grogu leave truncated the connective tissue between eras, reducing the potential to explore transitional phases within Jedi institutional reconstruction. Without Grogu, the temple lacked a student with the narrative weight to justify extended examination. The dynamic between Din and Grogu, while compelling on an interpersonal level, was designed around dependence rather than mutual growth. Din served as protector, caretaker, and emotional anchor, but he lacked the pedagogical skills required to guide Grogu's Force development. By returning Grogu to this dynamic, the story reverted to an earlier status quo, slowing character progression for both. Grogu's dependency remained intact rather than shifting toward autonomy. Din's role returned to preservation rather than evolution. This reversion weakened the trajectory established in the Season 2 finale, which had positioned separation as a necessary step in both characters' arcs. The significance of Grogu's training extended beyond personal growth. It represented a test of Luke's ability to shoulder the burden of instruction without replicating the rigid structures that contributed to Anakin's fall. Mentor-student relationships in Star Wars often illustrate ideological tension, and Grogu was uniquely suited to reveal Luke's strengths and weaknesses as a teacher. Removing Grogu constrained that exploration, leaving Luke's approach to instruction underdeveloped. The absence of a long-term student minimized opportunities to analyze the conditions that shaped Luke's eventual disillusionment without reducing that disillusionment to isolated events. Grogu's decision point between the lightsaber and the armor symbolized a thematic crossroads constructed to demonstrate the tension between heritage and personal choice. Remaining with Luke would have allowed that decision to evolve into a long-term examination of identity formation and the negotiation between past and future. Returning to Din resolved the tension prematurely, without allowing its philosophical implications to mature. The moment became a pivot rather than a launching point. A narrative structured around prolonged identity conflict became a return to comfort rather than an expansion of complexity. Luke's approach to training Grogu introduced the possibility of redefining the Jedi through principles focused on mindfulness, patience, and introspection rather than militarized response. Grogu's arc could have tested whether Luke could institutionalize these values within a new order. Removing Grogu curtailed that test, leaving the future of Luke's methodology obscure. The narrative lost the opportunity to contrast Luke's new teachings with the prequel era's institutional rigidity, limiting the scope of ideological exploration the show had set up. The structural logic of the Mandalorian storyline also aligned with Grogu remaining at the temple. Din's arc was trending toward leadership, responsibility, and independent identity formation. Grogu's departure supported that trajectory by shifting Din's focus from guardianship to societal integration. Returning Grogu kept Din anchored to the same emotional dynamic, preventing the shift toward broader Mandalorian politics that Season 2 had positioned as the next stage of his development. The separation was not a narrative detachment, but a thematic realignment that served both characters. The return to Din also hindered the thematic continuity that connected the Mandalorian era to the broader saga. Grogu's training offered a natural bridge between the fall of the old Jedi Order and the uncertain rise of Luke's new institution. This bridge was essential for contextualizing later events involving the Order's collapse. Without Grogu, the narrative lacked a character whose long-term perspective could illustrate early fractures or foundational strengths. The removal weakened inter-trilogy cohesion, forcing later stories to rely on exposition rather than organic character-driven continuity, achieved through gradual observation of Grogu's development within the Order. Grogu's exit nullified the emotional closure achieved at the end of Season 2. The farewell between Din and Grogu functioned as a culmination of 2 seasons of progression, symbolizing Din's acceptance of transition and Grogu's step toward independence. This moment carried structural weight because it demonstrated characters choosing evolution over comfort. Reversing this moment reduced its significance, transforming a pivotal, emotional decision into a temporary detour. The narrative's internal logic weakened as a result because meaningful sacrifice only maintains power when its consequences persist across subsequent storytelling. The reintroduction of Grogu into Din's care also diluted the exploration of Grogu's potential connection to other survivors of Order 66. Training under Luke would have allowed the series to confront the lingering psychological effects of the Jedi Purge in a controlled environment. The structured training context provided a foundation for examining trauma as a long-term developmental challenge. Returning Grogu to a nomadic lifestyle restricted the narrative's capacity to address these issues with depth. Instead of progressing through staged milestones of recovery, Grogu's past remained static, appearing in brief fragments rather than forming part of an organized arc. The decision also constrained the exploration of Grogu's relationship to the Force by limiting his exposure to consistent instruction. Under Luke, Grogu's progression could have been measured through deliberate reflection and contextualized discovery. Returning to Din transformed Grogu's abilities into situational tools rather than elements of a coherent developmental process. His powers became narrative conveniences rather than expressions of structured training. This shift weakened the internal logic of Force development by detaching it from disciplined instruction, creating an episodic rather than cumulative representation of ability. By disengaging from formal training, Grogu's role within the larger themes of post-Empire reconstruction diminished. His presence at the temple would have allowed the narrative to examine how emerging institutions attempted to stabilize a galaxy recovering from generational conflict. The Jedi Order represented not just a school, but a philosophical response to imperial collapse. Grogu's participation could have illustrated how such institutions confronted their historical failures while attempting to modernize. His departure removed a key mechanism for exploring how the galaxy approached reinvention after prolonged trauma, limiting the thematic reach of the series. Grogu's reunion with Din altered the structural balance of power between characters by maintaining Grogu as an influence on Din's emotional decisions rather than an autonomous participant in the narrative. The dynamic preserved early season tension, but prevented Grogu from acquiring the skills required to influence events independently. Instead of transitioning from assisted agency to self-directed capability, Grogu continued functioning within a narrow behavioral range, defined by reliance on Din's judgment. This constrained both characters, preventing the series from examining the complexities of evolving mentorship once the initial caretaker phase had concluded. The decision also affected the representation of Mandalorian culture. Din's trajectory toward leadership required emotional bandwidth unavailable while managing Grogu's needs. Separation supported this development by allowing Din to prioritize collective responsibility over individual caretaking. Reuniting the pair reoriented Din's attention back to Grogu, delaying meaningful engagement with Mandalorian political structures. Opportunities to examine shifts in tradition, governance, and cultural reintegration diminished as Din's narrative returned to intimate rather than institutional concerns. From a structural perspective, Grogu's departure from Luke reduced the potential for long-arc world-building related to the early Jedi institution. Grogu's sustained presence would have allowed gradual exploration of curriculum design, early student selection, and philosophical adaptation in the aftermath of galactic war. These elements provided a rare opportunity to depict the Jedi's reconstruction through experiential observation rather than retrospective exposition. Removing Grogu collapsed these opportunities, leaving the development of the New Order largely unexplored and disconnected from the character most suited to provide observational continuity. Grogu's exit also impacted the pacing of the Mandalorian series. Without the need to integrate long-term training sequences, the show shifted toward shorter, episodic structures, focused on immediate conflict resolution, rather than sequential development. This format limited the breadth of thematic exploration by reducing opportunities for gradual skill acquisition or ideological reflection. Grogu's training offered a mechanism for incorporating narrative variety, contrasting dynamic action with contemplative instruction. Removing that mechanism narrowed the tonal range of the show, centering it on repetition rather than evolution. The long-term implications of Grogu's departure extend into the broader trajectory of the franchise. His training under Luke had the potential to influence multiple storylines across different eras, creating cohesion through shared philosophy and interconnected growth. Without this foundation, future narratives lack a character who provides continuity across eras through experiential knowledge of post-war reconstruction. The absence reduces narrative coherence, requiring later stories to rely on retroactive explanation rather than organic development rooted in Grogu's participation in early Jedi revival efforts. Finally, Grogu's return to Din reinforced a pattern of narrative preservation in which franchise stability takes precedence over structural progression. The decision maintained a dynamic that generated early popularity, but limited the scope of potential development. Remaining with Luke would have allowed Grogu to serve as a link between eras, institutions, and philosophies. His departure severed that connection, confining his arc to a narrower narrative domain and leaving the series without a mechanism to explore broader themes related to identity, restoration, and institutional rebuilding across the evolving Star Wars
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.